The morning sun climbed slowly over the rolling hills as Jackson Miller wiped sweat from his forehead. At 36, his hands were rough and calloused, not from his previous career catching criminals, but from 5 years of honest farm work. The cool spring breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and growing things across his 10 acres of land. A welcome change from the smell of city streets and police station coffee that had filled his days for over a decade. "Come on, girl," Jackson called to his border collie, Pepper, who bounded alongside him as he carried wooden fence posts toward the road. The old wooden fence had taken a beating during winter storms, and several posts needed replacing before his weekend farm stand opened. Jackson's farm sat on what most folks would call the good side of town. Not quite country, but far enough from the city to see stars at night. Recently, developers had built fancy houses about half a mile down the road. The Oakwood Estates signs promised luxury living with countryside charm, though Jackson doubted many of those new neighbors knew the first thing about country living. He hammered a post into place, pleased with how the repair was coming along. His small organic farm had become his pride and joy after leaving police work. The old-timers at the local diner had laughed when he first arrived, telling him the neglected property was more weed than farm, but Jackson had proven them wrong. Now his vegetables won ribbons at the county fair, and restaurants in town competed for his heirloom tomatoes. The rumble of an engine broke his concentration. A shiny white SUV with chrome wheels slowed near his driveway, expensive and out of place against his weathered red barn. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop, tires kicking up gravel. Jackson straightened his back, removed his work gloves, and watched as a woman stepped out. She wore white pants that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, and a blue blouse that had never seen a day of real work. Her blonde hair was cut in a perfect sharp bob, and large designer sunglasses hid her eyes. But they couldn't hide the frown that formed on her face as she surveyed his property. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Jackson called out politely, the manners his mother taught him kicking in despite the woman's obvious disapproval. Instead of answering, she pulled out her phone and began recording, walking toward him with purpose in each step of her spotless, white sneakers. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to make Pepper duck behind Jackson's legs. Jackson tilted his head, confused by the question. "Fixing my fence," he replied simply, gesturing to the obvious repair work. "Is there something I can help you with?" The woman's perfectly lined lips pressed together before she spoke again. "I'm Diana Winters. I'm on the Homeowners Association board at Oakwood Estates." She said this as though it should impress him. When Jackson merely nodded, she continued, "This operation you're running here is becoming a serious problem." Jackson looked around at his neatly tended vegetable rows, the chicken coop where his free-range hens scratched happily in the dirt, and the small greenhouse where he started seedlings. "What problem would that be exactly?" Diana's face flushed slightly. "This unsightly farm operation is decreasing property values in our community. Our homes start at $750,000, and potential buyers don't want to see this." She waved her hand dismissively at his property while keeping her phone trained on his face. "Ma'am, I've owned this land for 5 years now. Your development is the newcomer here," Jackson explained calmly, reaching down to scratch Pepper's ears when the dog whined softly. "This is agriculturally zoned property, always has been." "Zoning can be changed," Diana snapped, "and there must be ordinances against having animals so close to residential neighborhoods. The smell alone must violate some health code." Jackson bit back a laugh. His farm was immaculate, and the nearest Oakwood Estates home was well beyond any distance required by county regulations. He'd made sure of that. His years in law enforcement had taught him to know the rules. "Everything here is up to code and properly permitted," he said, his voice remaining level despite his growing annoyance. "I run a clean operation. My animals are well cared for, and my composting follows all guidelines." Diana's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. "Well, we'll just see about that. Our community has connections, you know. The mayor played golf with our developer just last weekend." Jackson leaned on his shovel. "Look, Ms. Winters, I understand change can be difficult, but this land has been farmland for generations. The county encourages small-scale sustainable agriculture. If you'd like to learn more about what we do here, I host community tours every other Sunday. This only seemed to make Diana angrier. I don't need a tour of a hobby farm, she said, somehow making it sound like an insult. What I need is for you to clean this mess up. Those rain barrels look like something from a junkyard, and that compost pile is surely attracting pests. Jackson's rain collection system had actually been featured in a regional gardening magazine, and his 3-stage compost system was about as scientific and odor-free as composting could get. But he realized Diana wasn't interested in facts. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said simply. But I'm not breaking any rules, and I take pride in my farm. Diana's jaw tightened. We'll see what the authorities have to say about that. I pay a lot of taxes in this county, and I expect results when there's a problem. Jackson simply shrugged and turned back to his fence post. You do what you feel you need to do. This dismissal seemed to infuriate Diana more than anything else. She stomped back to her SUV, phone now pressed to her ear instead of pointed at him. Yes, I need to report a code violation, he heard her say as she climbed into her vehicle. It's urgent. Yes, an eyesore property that's definitely violating health ordinances. Yes, I'll hold. Jackson sighed and patted Pepper's head. Looks like we're in for an interesting afternoon, girl, he murmured as he watched Diana's animated conversation through her windshield. He couldn't help wondering what she would think if she knew about his previous career. But that was a card he'd play only if absolutely necessary. For now, he had a fence to fix before the police inevitably showed up. Jackson spent another hour working on his fence, trying to push the unpleasant encounter from his mind. Pepper had settled in a shady spot nearby, occasionally lifting her head to watch passing cars. The afternoon sun beat down and Jackson paused to take a long drink from his water bottle. He'd almost convinced himself that Diana's threats were just hot air when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. 2 white and blue patrol cars rolled into his driveway, lights off, but official nonetheless. Jackson straightened up and set his hammer down. He wasn't worried. He knew he wasn't breaking any rules. But old habits died hard. His years behind the badge had taught him that even routine calls could go sideways if tempers flared. Diana's SUV was parked on the shoulder of the road. She stood beside it, arms crossed over her chest, a look of smug satisfaction on her face as she watched the officers step out of their vehicles. Jackson recognized one of them immediately, Officer Tom Peterson, a younger cop who had joined the force during Jackson's final year before retirement. They'd never worked closely together, but Jackson remembered him as a decent sort, if a bit green. Afternoon, officers, Jackson called out, walking toward them with an easy stride. Pepper trotted alongside him, tail wagging cautiously. Good afternoon, sir, the older officer replied. His name tag read, Reynolds. We received a complaint about some potential code violations on this property. Diana moved closer, practically hovering at Officer Reynolds' elbow. That's right. I called it in. This whole operation is completely inappropriate for the area. Officer, Peterson's eyes scanned the property, taking in the tidy rows of vegetables, the modest chicken coop, and the small roadside stand, currently empty of produce. His expression suggested he was already questioning why they'd been called out. Ma'am, we'll handle this, Officer Reynolds said to Diana, his tone professional but firm. He turned back to Jackson. Sir, the complaint mentions concerns about unlicensed farming activities, noise violations, public health hazards, and an unauthorized business. Before Jackson could respond, Diana jumped in. Those chickens make noise at all hours, it's unbearable. And that pile of rotting waste must be attracting all sorts of vermin, not to mention the constant traffic from his illegal roadside stand. She pointed dramatically toward Jackson's modest farm stand, which was little more than a wooden table with a roof, currently empty, as it was only Wednesday. Ma'am, Officer Peterson said, please let us speak with the property owner. Diana ignored him completely. Furthermore, he's got some kind of industrial equipment back there. She gestured wildly toward Jackson's small tractor. I'm sure he doesn't have permits for that. And what about water usage? In this drought there should be restrictions. Jackson caught Officer Peterson's eye and saw the younger man suppress a smile. They both knew that agricultural properties had different water allowances during conservation periods. The character of our neighborhood is being destroyed, Diana continued, her voice rising. Our homes are worth nearly $1 million, and this eyesore is driving down property values. I've already spoken to my real estate agent and she agrees. Officer Reynolds tried to interject. Ma'am, if you could just... And I'm not the only one concerned. Diana steamrolled on. The entire homeowners association is prepared to take legal action if necessary. My husband plays golf with Judge Wilson, you know. Jackson stood quietly, hands in his pockets, letting the storm blow itself out. He'd dealt with enough heated situations in his former career to know that keeping calm was always the best approach. Pepper sat at his feet, head tilted curiously at the commotion. The smell alone must violate some ordinance, Diana insisted, wrinkling her nose, though the air held nothing but the scent of fresh soil and growing things. And I'm certain those rain barrels are breeding mosquitoes. That's a public health issue right there. Officer Peterson had begun walking slowly around the visible part of the property, his trained eye taking in details. Sir, how long have you owned this land? He asked Jackson, interrupting Diana's monologue. 5 years now, Jackson replied. It's been agricultural land for generations before that. Diana let out an exasperated huff. The zoning needs to be updated. Times have changed. This area is becoming upscale residential, and farms don't belong here anymore. Actually, the county has been encouraging small-scale sustainable agriculture, Officer Peterson commented. There was that whole initiative last year. Well, there must be regulations about how close to residential areas these operations can be. Diana cut in. And I'm certain he's violating several of them. Those chickens alone, they're all hens, Jackson interjected calmly. No roosters. They quiet down completely at dusk. Diana's eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses. So you admit they make noise during the day. Officer, I work from home. How am I supposed to concentrate with constant clucking? Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. Sir, do you have permits for your agricultural activities? Jackson nodded. Yes, I do. Every aspect of this operation is properly permitted and up to code. I'd be happy to show you all my paperwork. I'm sure he's missing something, Diana insisted. Nobody follows every single rule. There must be violations here somewhere. Officer Peterson stepped closer to Jackson. If we could see those permits, sir, that would help clear things up. Of course, Jackson said. They're in the house. You're welcome to follow me. I'm coming too, Diana announced, already moving, forward with her phone still recording. I want to make sure nothing gets overlooked. As they walked toward the farmhouse, Diana kept up a running commentary, noting supposed infractions with each step. Look at that garden hose. Probably violating water restrictions. And that compost bin must be attracting rats, and is that a beehive back there? Surely he needs special permits for keeping bees so close to a residential area. Jackson caught Officer Reynolds giving his partner a look that clearly said, one of those calls. Both officers had probably responded to dozens of neighbor disputes that were more about personal dislike than actual violations. I have all my documentation inside, Jackson said as they reached his front porch. The modest farmhouse had been restored over the past 5 years. Its once peeling paint now a fresh white with green trim. Flower boxes under the windows held bright blooms, and the wooden steps had been recently swept. You'll see that everything here is properly permitted and well within regulations. Jackson continued, holding the screen door open. And after we go through the paperwork, I'd be happy to give you both a tour of the property so you can see for yourselves. Diana pushed forward, nearly shouldering past Officer Peterson. I'll be filming everything to make sure nothing gets missed, she announced, holding her phone up like a weapon. Ma'am, Officer Reynolds said firmly, I need to ask you to stop recording while we're inside the residence. But, Diana began to protest. That's department policy when entering private homes, Reynolds continued. You're welcome to wait outside if you prefer to keep recording. Diana reluctantly lowered her phone, but her expression made it clear she wasn't backing down. As Jackson led them into his tidy living room, he caught her muttering under her breath, I'll see this through to the end. Mark my words. Jackson's living room was simple but comfortable. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on farming, gardening, and somewhat surprisingly, criminal justice. A worn leather couch faced a stone fireplace, and morning sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked the vegetable fields. The space had the lived-in feel of a home rather than a showplace. "Have a seat, officers," Jackson offered, gesturing to the couch. "Can I get you some water? It's hot out there." "No, thank you, sir," Officer Reynolds replied professionally. "We'd just like to see the documentation for your property." Diana remained standing, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, no doubt looking for violations to add to her growing list. "Of course," Jackson said. "Just let me grab my files from the office." As he stepped into the adjoining room, Diana leaned toward Officer Peterson. "Check the kitchen, too," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I bet he's got health code violations in there. Probably processing food without proper certification." Officer Peterson gave her a look that said more than words could, and Diana huffed impatiently. Jackson returned carrying a thick folder, which he placed on the coffee table. "Here's everything," he said, opening the folder to reveal neatly organized documents. Property deed, agricultural zoning confirmation, business license for the farm stand, organic certification paperwork, livestock permits for the chickens, water usage allocation. He spread the papers out methodically, the organization suggesting someone used to keeping detailed records. Officer Reynolds began examining the documents carefully. "These all appear to be in order, sir." "Keep looking," Diana insisted. "There must be something missing." Jackson couldn't help but notice how Officer Peterson was studying the photos on his mantel. One showed Jackson in his police uniform, standing proudly next to his father, also in uniform. Another captured him receiving an award, though the specific details weren't visible from across the room. "Mr. Miller," Officer Peterson said slowly. "Your name sounds familiar. Have we met before?" Jackson smiled slightly. "We may have crossed paths. I was with Metro PD until about 5 years ago." Diana's head snapped up. "What?" Officer Reynolds looked up from the documents, suddenly more interested. "You were on the force?" he asked. Jackson nodded. 10 years. Agricultural Crimes Unit for the last 4 of those. "Agricultural crimes," Diana repeated, her voice rising slightly. That's not even a real thing." "Actually, ma'am, it is," Officer Peterson said. "They handle everything from livestock theft to illegal pesticide use to water rights violations." A flicker of recognition crossed Officer Reynolds' face. "Wait a minute. Miller, Jackson Miller, weren't you the detective who broke up that big cattle rustling operation a few years back? Made the front page of the Tribune?" "That was me," Jackson admitted with a modest shrug, "though it was a team effort." "I remember that case," Officer Peterson added, growing animated. "They were stealing prize bulls from all over the county, right? Had that sophisticated transport network. And forging ear tags and brand inspections." Jackson nodded. "It took us nearly a year to put it all together." Diana stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, looking back and forth between Jackson and the officers. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. "You're a cop?" she finally managed. "Detective, actually," Jackson corrected gently. "Retired now, but I keep my certification active. Still help with training occasionally." He walked to a small desk in the corner of the room and pulled out his wallet. From it, he removed an ID card and handed it to Officer Reynolds. "I should probably show you this as well." The officer studied the card, Jackson's retired law enforcement credentials, and passed it to his partner. Officer Peterson examined it with obvious respect. "Wow, Detective Miller, it's an honor," the younger officer said. "That cattle rustling case was covered in one of my academy classes as an example of thorough investigation techniques." Diana seemed to deflate slightly, her righteous indignation fading as the reality of the situation became clear. She stepped forward, trying to see the ID card. "Let me see that." Officer Peterson hesitated, then handed her the credentials. Diana stared at the photo ID, which showed Jackson in his formal police portrait, along with his badge number and detective rank clearly displayed. But you're just a farmer," she stammered, her previous confidence evaporating. The phone she'd been so eager to record with hung limply at her side. "I'm both, ma'am," Jackson replied evenly. "I served the community as a police officer for a decade, and now I serve it by growing healthy food. Both are important jobs." Diana handed back the ID card quickly, as if it had suddenly become hot to the touch. She looked around the room with new eyes, noticing for the first time the framed commendations on the wall, partially hidden behind a houseplant. A small display box on a bookshelf held a police badge. "I don't understand," she said, her voice smaller now. "Why would you leave being a detective to dig in the dirt?" Something flickered across Jackson's face, a shadow of old memories. "Law enforcement is important work, but it takes a toll. After 10 years, I needed a change. Growing things, it heals something inside you." Officer Reynolds nodded with understanding. He'd likely seen enough in his own career to grasp what Jackson meant. "So let me get this straight," Diana said, finding her voice again. "You were some kind of agricultural detective, and now you run a farm?" "That's right," Jackson confirmed. "Which means I know exactly what permits I need and what regulations apply to my operation." He gestured to the paperwork spread across the table. "As you can see, everything is in perfect order." Officer Peterson picked up the organic certification documents. "These are actually impressive, sir. It's not easy to get this level of certification." "It took 2 years," Jackson acknowledged. "Worth it, though. I don't use any chemicals that could harm the soil or water supply, which incidentally also means I'm not violating any environmental regulations regarding runoff or contamination." This last part he directed gently toward Diana. Officer Reynolds had finished examining the documents and was gathering them together. "Well, Mr. Miller, or should I say Detective Miller, everything appears to be completely in order here." "Jackson is fine," he said with a small smile. "Like I said, I'm retired now." "Not completely, from what I hear," Officer Peterson said. "Didn't you help train the K-9 unit last spring?" Jackson nodded. "I still volunteer with the department occasionally. Old habits die hard, I guess." Diana stood in stunned silence, the realization dawning that she had been aggressively confronting and filming a decorated former detective, one who apparently still had close ties to the local police department. Her face had flushed a deep red that clashed with her perfectly applied blush. "So are we done here?" Jackson asked the officers, gathering up his documents and returning them to the folder. "Yes, sir," Officer Reynolds confirmed. "Sorry to have taken up your time today. Your farm appears to be operating fully within all applicable codes and regulations." The 4 of them stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun. Pepper, who had been waiting patiently on the porch, trotted over to greet them, her tail wagging. Jackson scratched behind her ears affectionately. "Beautiful dog," Officer Peterson commented. "Border Collie?" "Yeah," Jackson nodded. "Best farm helper I could ask for. She keeps the chickens in line better than I ever could." Diana remained unusually quiet, her earlier outrage replaced by obvious discomfort. She kept glancing between Jackson and the officers, trying to figure out how to salvage her dignity from the situation. "Well, Mr. Miller," Officer Reynolds said, tucking his notebook into his pocket. "As I mentioned, everything appears to be in proper order. Your permits are current, and your operation falls well within the guidelines for agricultural use in this area." Jackson nodded. "I appreciate you taking the time to check everything so thoroughly. Actually," Officer Peterson added with a slight smile, "your setup here is kind of a model for how small-scale farming should work in semi-rural areas. Those water conservation measures are impressive." "Thanks," Jackson replied. "I learned a lot about best practices during my time investigating agricultural crimes. Saw plenty of examples of what not to do, too." Diana cleared her throat. "So that's it? There's nothing to be done about—" She gestured vaguely at the farm. "All this?" Officer Reynolds turned to her with a professionally neutral expression, though his eyes had hardened slightly. Ms. Winters, we've thoroughly reviewed Mr. Miller's documentation and inspected the visible portions of his property. Everything is in compliance with county regulations. But the noise? She protested, though with much less conviction than before. And the smell. And the eyesore factor. Ma'am, Officer Peterson said patiently, I don't detect any unusual odors beyond what you'd expect from a normal, well-maintained farm. As for noise, agricultural sounds are specifically exempted from normal noise ordinances in this county, though Mr. Miller doesn't even have roosters, which would be the main concern. Furthermore, Officer Reynolds added, aesthetic concerns about legally zoned agricultural operations aren't something law enforcement can address. That would be a matter for the zoning board, and even then, established agricultural properties typically have strong protections. Diana's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her phone case as she searched for another angle. What about the traffic from his farm stand? Surely that's a safety hazard on this road. Jackson spoke up. The county transportation department approved my driveway width and parking area specifically for the farm stand. They even helped me design the pull-off area to ensure road safety. He nodded toward the gravel area beside his driveway, which was indeed designed to allow cars to pull completely off the road. Diana's shoulders slumped slightly. She was running out of complaints. However, Officer Reynolds said, his tone becoming more serious as he turned toward Diana, there is another matter we need to discuss. Diana straightened, a flash of hope crossing her face. Yes? Your 911 call, the officer continued. The transcript indicates you reported this as an emergency, situation requiring immediate police response. Diana blinked rapidly. Well, yes. I was concerned about potential health violations and... Ma'am, Officer Reynolds interrupted firmly. The 911 system is reserved for emergencies. Situations involving immediate danger to life, health, or property. Code enforcement concerns don't qualify as emergencies. Officer Peterson nodded in agreement. For non-emergency situations like zoning questions or code compliance issues, there's a separate county line you should call. I wasn't aware of that, Diana said, her voice smaller now. It's clearly stated when you first dial 911, Officer Reynolds pointed out. The automated system asks if this is an emergency before connecting you to a dispatcher. Diana's face flushed again. I may have exaggerated the urgency of the situation to ensure a prompt response. Ms. Winters, Officer Reynolds said, his voice taking on the formal tone of an official warning, misuse of emergency services is something we take very seriously. It diverts resources from genuine emergencies and can put lives at risk. I didn't think, Diana began. That's precisely the problem, Officer Reynolds cut in. In the time we've spent addressing your complaints about a fully permitted farm, we could have been responding to actual emergencies. Jackson watched the exchange quietly, his expression unreadable. He'd been on the other side of these conversations many times during his law enforcement days. Am I in trouble? Diana asked, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. Very different from her earlier demanding tone. I could issue a citation for misuse of emergency services, Officer Reynolds said, which carries a fine of up to $500 for first-time offenders. Diana's eyes widened in alarm. Her hand tightened around her designer purse as if already protecting her wallet. However, the officer continued, since this appears to be your first offense, I'm going to issue a formal warning instead. He pulled out his citation book and began writing. This will be on record, Ms. Winters. If there's a second occurrence, you will face the full penalty. I understand, Diana said quickly. It won't happen again. Additionally, Officer Peterson added, I'd recommend you familiarize yourself with the county's Right to Farm Act. It specifically protects agricultural operations from nuisance complaints when they're operating legally, even when residential development occurs nearby. As Officer Reynolds tore the written warning from his notebook and handed it to Diana, Jackson decided to extend an olive branch. Ms. Winters, he said gently, I understand this isn't what you expected when you moved to the area. If you'd like, I'd be happy to show you around the farm sometime, explain what we do here. Most of the concerns you raised about smells, pests, and water usage are actually addressed by the sustainable methods we use. Diana looked at him with surprise, clearly not expecting kindness after her behavior. I'll think about it, she replied stiffly, carefully folding the warning and placing it in her purse. Well, I think we're done here, Officer Reynolds announced. Mr. Miller, sorry for the disruption to your day. No problem at all, Jackson replied. Always good to show that everything's above board. As they walked back toward the patrol cars, Officer Peterson paused. You know, my wife has been wanting to try more organic produce. Is your farm stand open on weekends? Every Saturday from 8 to 2, Jackson nodded. We'll have the first strawberries of the season this weekend. And plenty of spring greens. Great. We might stop by, the younger officer replied with genuine enthusiasm. Diana had already retreated to her SUV, her earlier confidence completely deflated. Through the windshield, they could see her checking her makeup in the visor mirror, perhaps trying to regain some composure. She's new to the area, Jackson said quietly to the officers. Probably didn't realize what she was getting into when she moved next to farmland. Officer Reynolds shook his head slightly. That's generous of you, considering how she approached the situation. But then, you've always had a good reputation for being fair, Detective Miller. Just Jackson now, he reminded them with a smile. The detective days are behind me. Well, the department still appreciates your help with training, Officer Peterson said. That session you ran on rural crime investigation techniques was one of the best we've had. As the officers prepared to leave, Jackson couldn't help noticing how Diana sat in her idling vehicle, staring straight ahead, likely replaying the events of the afternoon in her mind and realizing how badly her plan had backfired. In the days following the confrontation, Jackson noticed Diana's white SUV drive slowly past his property several times. She never stopped, just cruised by at a reduced speed, perhaps taking in details she'd missed during her angry visit. Jackson simply waved each time, whether she acknowledged him or not. The weekend farm stand was busier than usual. Word had somehow spread about the standoff between the farmer and the fancy lady from the new development, as the locals called it. Small towns had their own speedy way of circulating news, often faster than any social media platform. Heard you had some excitement, Mrs. Cooper said as she selected a bundle of fresh spinach. The elderly woman had been one of Jackson's first regular customers and never missed a Saturday. Just a misunderstanding, Jackson replied diplomatically, weighing her vegetables. New neighbor wasn't familiar with agricultural zoning. Mrs. Cooper hummed knowingly. Ryan at the coffee shop said she nearly swallowed her tongue when she found out you used to be with the police. Jackson chuckled. News travels fast around here. Always has, she agreed, handing over her money. You know, before all these big houses went up, this was just farmland as far as you could see. My daddy used to grow corn right where that clubhouse stands now. Another customer joined the conversation. My brother lives in that development. Says the homeowners association has been telling folks that all the surrounding farms would eventually be bought out for more houses. He shook his head. Been filling their heads with nonsense about property values going up once the rural elements were gone. That explained some of Diana's confidence, Jackson thought. She'd been led to believe his farm was just a temporary inconvenience that would soon disappear. The most surprising visitor that day was Officer Peterson, true to his word, along with his wife and 2 young daughters. The girls were delighted by the chickens that pecked around the edge of the yard, safely contained by a movable fence. Place looks even better in the daylight, Peterson commented, as his wife filled a basket with fresh produce. The department's having a cookout next month. You should stop by, reconnect with some of the old-timers. Jackson promised to think about it. His departure from police work had been amicable but firm. He'd needed the clean break, the complete change of pace. Still, he missed some of the camaraderie. As the weeks passed, Jackson noticed something odd. The complaints that had occasionally trickled in from Diana's gated community suddenly stopped. Before her confrontation, he'd received calls from the county about various supposed violations every month or so. always investigated, never founded. But now, silence. He wondered if Diana had found a new target for her regulatory fervor, or if perhaps the embarrassment of their encounter had convinced her to back off. Either way, he was grateful for the peace. It was nearly a month after the incident when Jackson stepped onto his porch one morning to find a package sitting by the door. No delivery truck had come up the drive. He would have heard it. Someone had dropped it off quietly. The gift basket was wrapped in cellophane, tied with a ribbon and filled with local products. Honey from the apiary down the road, artisan cheese from the dairy 2 towns over, and a bottle of wine from a nearby vineyard. Items that even Jackson, with his focus on vegetables, didn't produce himself. Attached was a card in elegant handwriting. I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable. I've since learned more about sustainable farming and the importance of local agriculture. Your farm isn't decreasing our property values. It's actually part of what makes this area special. If the offer still stands, I'd like to learn more about your community education programs. Sincerely, Diana Winters. Jackson read the note twice, surprised by the gesture. People rarely admitted they were wrong these days, especially so thoroughly. He placed the basket on his kitchen counter, wondering if he should call her, then decided to wait. If she was sincere, she'd make the next move herself. That Saturday, among the usual crowd at the farm stand, Jackson spotted a familiar blonde bob. Diana approached hesitantly, no longer in pristine white but wearing more practical jeans and a simple blouse. She waited until the other customers had been served before stepping forward. "Hello," she said, her voice lacking its previous sharp ch. "I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome after everything." "Everyone's welcome at the farm stand," Jackson replied evenly. "Thanks for the gift basket. That was thoughtful." Diana fidgeted with the strap of her purse. "It was the least I could do after how I behaved. I was..." She paused, seemingly struggling with the words, completely out of line. Jackson nodded, appreciating the direct acknowledgement. "Our homeowners association had been telling us that all these small farms were driving down property values," she continued. "After what happened, I decided to check for myself. I spoke with 3 real estate agents and..." She shook her head. "They all said the opposite is true. Homes near sustainable farms like yours actually sell for more these days. People want access to local food." "That doesn't surprise me," Jackson said. "The trend has been heading that way for years." Diana glanced around at the neatly kept farm stand, the cheerful sunflowers planted alongside it, the obvious care that went into the presentation. "I can see why now. It's actually quite lovely." A slightly awkward silence fell between them. "You mentioned community education programs?" Diana finally asked. "We do tours every other Sunday," Jackson replied. "Show people how organic farming works, let the kids meet the chickens, that sort of thing." "My husband thinks I'm crazy, but I'd like to join one," Diana said with a small, self-deprecating smile. "And my daughter's science class is doing a project on sustainable agriculture. I thought maybe..." "Next tour is tomorrow at 10, Jackson offered. "Family's welcome." To his surprise, Diana did return the next day, husband and children in tow. Her husband, Robert, a tall man with a perpetual expression of mild confusion, kept checking his golf watch. But their kids, a boy about 12 and a girl around 8, were immediately captivated by Pepper's expert herding of the chickens. Jackson kept the tour simple, explaining natural pest control methods, water conservation techniques, and how crop rotation kept the soil healthy. Diana asked thoughtful questions, occasionally taking notes on her phone, not recording video this time, just writing things down. "So you really don't use any chemical pesticides?" she asked, genuinely curious. "How do you keep the bugs from eating everything?" Jackson showed her the beneficial insect habitats he'd built around the farm. "These attract the good bugs that eat the bad bugs. It's about balance, not elimination." By the end of the tour, even Robert seemed reluctantly interested, especially when Jackson explained how the farm's water usage per acre was actually lower than the average lawn in their subdivision. "We're having a neighborhood cookout next weekend," Diana said as they were leaving. "Would you consider bringing some of your produce to sell there? I think it would help people understand what you're doing here." Over the summer months, an unexpected transformation took place. Diana, once the farm's most vocal opponent, became its unlikely advocate. She joined Jackson's CSA program, receiving a weekly box of fresh produce. She brought friends to the farm tours. She even helped organize a farm-to-table dinner featuring Jackson's vegetables at the gated community's clubhouse. When new families moved into Oakwood Estates and began complaining about the nearby farm, it was Diana who took them aside to explain the situation. "Actually," Jackson overheard her telling a new neighbor at the farm stand one day, "we're incredibly lucky to have this farm so close. Do you know how many communities are creating special tax incentives to attract operations exactly like this? One, we got it for free." And whenever she told the story of her first encounter with Jackson, she always ended with the same line, delivered with a self-deprecating laugh. "You should have seen my face when that simple farmer I'd been harassing pulled out his detective badge. I nearly died on the spot. Taught me a valuable lesson about making assumptions and about the interesting lives people lead when you take the time to actually know them."